then a question I get asked all the time is how can I make my photos look sharper? Or when I shoot, my photos just don't look as sharp as yours. So in today's video, I want to go through 6 main reasons your photos are not sharp and how to fix it. Plus, all these reasons apply to any camera you might be using, from mirrorless all the way to DSLRs. I've bunched up our sharpness issues into 2 categories. We have external reasons your photos are not sharp and internal reasons. So let's start with the external ones. The first reason your photos might not be sharp is something that is super easy to fix, and you should be doing this before every single photo shoot anyway, which is to clean your dirty gear. Even if you are really careful with your camera gear, using it and changing lenses will inevitably lead it to getting dirty in one way or another. You might get fingerprints on it, ocean mist can create a fine layer that affects the front of the lens, or in general, you might just have dirt or dust on the lens that will stop you from achieving the sharpest results possible. I clean my lenses before every single photo shoot that I do to ensure that I'm able to capture good quality photos. When you're cleaning your lens, make sure to check the front and back element, as both sides can get dirty. Number 2 is if you use a filter on your lens, whether it's a clear UV filter, an ND filter, a polarizing filter, basically any kind of filter, this could be affecting your sharpness as well. Depending on the quality of your filter, it can cause extra lens flares or make your photos softer. A good way to test if this is the reason your photos are not sharp is to put your camera on a tripod at home and take the same photo with and without the filter on your lens and compare the sharpness on your computer. By the way, when you're cleaning your lens, make sure you take a look at the space in between the lens and the UV filter. I personally wouldn't clean this before every single shoot since I rarely take my UV filters off, but if you change filters regularly, then definitely wipe that down as well. The next reason could be due to the lens you're using, because different lenses have different levels of sharpness. This is a very extreme example, but I think it shows what I'm trying to say really well. I used a vintage lens on my Sony a7 IV the other day because they're fun to shoot with and you can get interesting results, but as you can see here, here's an out of focus shot, and here's the next frame which I did get in focus on India Rose's face. But when you're zoomed in to the 1:1 view, you can see that it's just not that sharp. It's really lacking a lot of detail. And like I said, this is a very extreme example, as this is a super old lens not really designed for cameras that capture high resolution images. So if you're finding that the lens you're using isn't tack sharp when wide open, you can try stepping down your aperture to find a sharper point in the lens. Sometimes I like to shoot with an aperture of f2 or f2.8 to make sure I can capture very sharp images while still being able to utilize depth of field and have that nice bokeh in the background. Before we move on to focus settings and other internal reasons your photos are not sharp, I want to let you know more about the sponsor of today's video, Motion Array. You may have noticed that I've been using these handy assets throughout today's video, and I got these all from Motion Array. I love how easy Motion Array is to use. You can choose from a monthly or yearly subscription to get unlimited downloads on over 700,000 video templates, stock footage, photos, music, and sound effects, and you can use these assets wherever and whenever you like. These templates are available for Premiere Pro, After Effects, Final Cut Pro, and DaVinci Resolve. So if you want to try out Motion Array to add some extra depth and interest to your own videos, you can use the link in my description to get $50 off your yearly subscription. So now let's move on to internal camera settings, which brings me to aperture. If you're shooting wide open at f1.2 or f1.4, you may be expecting too much from your photos. Taking photos with a shallow depth of field can create some beautiful results, but it is also a tricky way to shoot. Depending on your focal length, the angle you're shooting from, or how far or close you are from the subject, it can really change what parts of your frame are in focus. So let's take a look at this close-up portrait here that I shot on a 50mm f1.2 lens. As you can see, we have a tiny slither of where the photo is in focus. Her iris is tack sharp, but you can already see her eyebrows going out of focus and only parts of her face are in focus. If this is what you're seeing in your photos and you don't like that effect, then your solution is to shoot with a smaller aperture. Instead of shooting at f1.2, you could shoot at f2 or f3.5 to still retain that nice depth of field between your subject and the background, but instead you will be able to have more of the face in focus. On the other side of the scale, say you want maximum sharpness and you don't want any bokeh or depth of field, so you bump your aperture up to the highest setting it goes, like f16 or f22. Well, this can actually have the opposite effect, where your small aperture will start making your photo look out of focus again due to diffraction. If this is what you're seeing in your photos, then I would recommend to set up your tripod and take the same photo at different apertures to find the optimal sharpness you're after, as it's different depending on what lens you're using. The next reason your photos are not looking super sharp might be because of motion blur, and there are 3 main ways that this can happen. The first one is motion blur from your camera. This means that a photo will look a little something like this. You can see that the entire photo from the foreground to the background has motion blur. This can happen if you are hand holding your camera, walking while taking photos, or you bump your tripod while you're taking a photo. If this is what you're seeing in your photos, then there are a couple of ways that we can fix this. First is an easy one. If you're photographing a stationary subject such as a landscape, you can pop your camera on a sturdy tripod. If you are hand holding your camera, you need to use a fast enough shutter speed to reduce movement in your camera while you're taking a photo. So depending how steady you are, you might be able to hand hold a photo at a shutter speed of as low as 1/60. For me personally, during my portrait photo shoots, I love walking around and moving to capture different compositions. I love talking to my team and giving my subject directions while I'm taking the photos, so I know I would not be able to hold my camera steady at 1/60 because I just move way too much. Instead, with time and experimenting, I have worked out that a shutter speed of 1/200 is the slowest that I should use for the way that I work to still achieve sharp photos. If I use anything slower than that, then I will end up with a higher ratio of photos with motion blur, which I don't want. The next thing that might be stopping you from capturing sharp photos is that you're getting motion blur from your subject. Unlike motion blur from your camera, it will instead look like this. You can see that only the subject is affected by motion blur and the rest of the photo looks normal. This typically happens when your subject is moving fast in the frame, and in this case, we were getting some walking shots with Serena during blue hour. If you're finding that your subject is too blurry in the frame, then you need to make your shutter speed faster to be able to freeze their movement. So I can use a slower shutter speed of 1/200 if I ask my subject to slow down and pause in between poses. But if I want to capture a shot of them walking, for example, I will need to make my shutter speed faster. One last thing to keep in mind that can affect motion blur in your images is the focal length that you choose to shoot with. The longer your lens, the more chance there is for motion blur. And usually as it's getting darker, I like to switch to wider angle lenses as there is more wiggle room with shutter speed. A good rule of thumb to keep in mind, which is what I always do, is to at least double the shutter speed of your focal length. So for example, if you're using a 200mm focal length, you want to multiply that by 2, which is 400. This means that you should try to keep your shutter speed over 1/400 to reduce motion blur. By the way, if changing your aperture and working out what shutter speed you should be using sounds a little bit confusing, I do have a whole video about how to change your camera settings, which I'll leave linked down below. The final reason your photos might not be sharp is because of the focus settings that you're using. The first focus setting that you need to take a look at is pretty universal between cameras, and that is whether you are shooting in one shot or continuous autofocus. On Canon cameras, this would be called single shot and AI servo. I like using one shot for photographing a stationary subject, such as people standing still or landscapes. In one shot, you half press your shutter, which locks off focus. Then you can recompose your shot while focus stays locked on your original point. On the other hand, with servo modes or continuous autofocus, when you select a focus point and half press your shutter, it won't lock off focus. Instead, the focus will continuously change as you or your subject moves around, and this is a great focus mode to use for portrait photography, photographing moving subjects, or if you're hand holding your camera. And the reason I say that is because unless you are leaning against a solid structure, you naturally move around a little bit without even noticing when taking photos. So if you're shooting at f1.2, as I showed you earlier, it's an extremely narrow depth of field. So if you move forward even half a centimeter, it can cause your photo to be out of focus. And this is why shooting in continuous autofocus is extremely handy. There are a few more focus settings that I use specifically when shooting on Sony mirrorless cameras that include subject shift sensitivity and focus transition speeds. And these focus settings come in really handy when I'm photographing weddings or events and there are usually a lot of people walking through my frame. I do have another video that goes into more detail about this, so if you're interested, I'll leave that link down below as well. It's my Sony a7 IV focus setup guide. So that is all I have for today's video. I really hope this helped you out. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, but as always, thank you so much for watching. I make new videos every single week, so I will see you all next time. Bye!